December 1941. Snow falls over Moscow. But this time, the Soviet capital is not preparing for a counterattack. German soldiers are marching through Red Square. The Kremlin is occupied. The swastika flies above the heart of the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was the ultimate prize, the city that symbolized Soviet power, the city where railways, communications, government command, and military coordination all converged into a single nervous system. In our timeline, Germany never captured Moscow. The offensive stalled just kilometers from the city. Mud swallowed tanks, supply lines collapsed. Winter arrived faster than expected, and the Red Army, recovering from shock, launched a counteroffensive that pushed the Wehrmacht back for the first time. That moment marked the beginning of a shift in the entire war. But what if one decision, one weather pattern, or one successful breakthrough had changed everything? What if Moscow had fallen? At first, the consequences would have appeared overwhelming. The psychological shock alone would have been global. Foreign governments would see German troops inside the Soviet capital and assume the collapse of the entire Soviet system was imminent. Some intelligence agencies would begin drafting post-Soviet scenarios. Neutral countries would reconsider alliances. Axis propaganda would explode with claims of final victory. German newspapers would describe the capture of Moscow not as a battle, but as the end of history in the East. But wars are rarely decided by symbolism, because despite its importance, Moscow was not the Soviet Union. The Soviet government had already anticipated catastrophic scenarios. Emergency evacuation plans had been prepared long before German forces reached the city. Factories were already being dismantled and moved eastward in a massive industrial relocation unseen in modern history. Entire production lines were transported beyond the Ural Mountains. Rail systems were reorganized, not to defend Moscow, but to preserve the state beyond it. Even if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union would not vanish. It would mutate. Stalin and the central leadership would almost certainly relocate further east, likely to cities like Kivyshev. Military command structures would continue operating. Radio networks would remain functional, and millions of soldiers already mobilized would still be in the field. The Soviet Union would be wounded, but not decapitated. Meanwhile, Germany would begin to face a far more dangerous reality than the battle itself: distance. The Wehrmacht was already stretched across thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. Every advance east multiplied logistical strain. Every captured town extended the supply chain further into collapse. Fuel shortages became routine, vehicle breakdowns increased dramatically, entire divisions paused, not because of enemy fire, but because they simply ran out of fuel. Capturing Moscow would not solve this problem. It would intensify it, because now the front line would sit inside a devastated, partially destroyed metropolis that still required full military occupation. And occupation is not victory, it is consumption. Now imagine a German infantry division stationed in Moscow during winter. Food must travel from Germany or occupied Poland. Fuel must travel along fragile rail lines. Winter clothing arrives late, if at all, and every supply convoy becomes a target. Every road becomes a liability. Every railway junction becomes a vulnerability point. And behind German lines, resistance begins to grow. Soviet partisans, initially disorganized, become increasingly effective. Railways are destroyed in coordinated attacks, bridges collapse in isolated regions, supply depots burn during night raids, communication cables are cut, entire sections of the front become blind overnight. To counter this, Germany must divert more troops away from the front lines. More soldiers assigned not to fight, but to hold, and the deeper the occupation spreads, the more the front weakens. At the same time, something critical continues happening beyond the German reach. Soviet industry is not destroyed, it is relocating. Factories beyond the Urals begin operating at increasing efficiency. What initially looked like a desperate evacuation becomes a functioning wartime economy. Tank production increases, aircraft output stabilizes, artillery manufacturing expands. The Soviet Union, despite losing its capital, is building a second industrial state far beyond German reach. Germany may have taken the symbolic center, but it has not taken the engine of war. Then comes another structural problem: manpower. Germany entered Operation Barbarossa expecting a rapid collapse of Soviet resistance. Instead, it became a war of attrition on a continental scale. Every engagement consumes trained soldiers. Every victory carries casualties. Every month reduces the pool of experienced manpower. And while Germany struggles to replace losses, the Soviet Union does something Germany cannot easily match. It mobilizes depth. Millions of additional soldiers drawn from vast territory, new armies formed in the east, New defensive lines constructed continuously as older ones collapse. The war does not end, it expands. Further east, further into unfamiliar territory, further into logistical impossibility. The fighting shifts away from Moscow toward the Volga, toward the Caucasus oil fields, toward the industrial zones of the Urals, toward regions so vast that controlling them requires more resources than conquering them ever did. And this raises a question that appears simple but is misleading. Would capturing Moscow force the Soviet Union to surrender? History suggests otherwise. In 1812, Napoleon captured Moscow. The city burned and emptied, yet the Russian Empire continued the war, and eventually Napoleon's invasion collapsed under its own weight. A century later, Hitler would face a structurally similar reality, but on an even larger scale. Because the Soviet Union was not a centralized system dependent on one city, it was a continental structure built on three advantages: space, resources, and strategic depth. Even after losing Moscow, Soviet forces could retreat thousands of kilometers and continue fighting. Germany could not match that depth. Every kilometer forward increased vulnerability. Every new territory required occupation forces. Every advance turned into a long-term burden. The Nazi war machine was optimized for rapid, decisive campaigns. It was not designed for prolonged continental occupation against an enemy that refuses to collapse. A Soviet Union continuing resistance after the fall of Moscow would fundamentally break the German strategy. What was meant to be a lightning war would become an endless war. A war consuming fuel faster than it could be produced, consuming equipment faster than it could be replaced, consuming soldiers faster than they could be trained. By 1942 and 1943, even in this altered timeline, the same structural weaknesses remain. Germany is overstretched, its supply chains are fragile, its industrial base is outmatched, its occupation zones are increasingly unstable. The front may shift eastward, the geography may change, the casualty numbers may increase or decrease, but the underlying equation does not change. Germany does not possess the resources required to permanently dominate the Soviet Union, and over time, the imbalance begins to grow. Soviet production increases, German losses accumulate, partisan warfare intensifies, occupied territories become administrative burdens instead of strategic assets. The empire expands beyond its ability to sustain itself. This is the paradox of Moscow. Capturing it would have been Hitler's greatest symbolic victory, but it may also have accelerated the collapse of the entire system, because the more Germany conquered, the more it exposed its fundamental limitation. Not strategy, not leadership, but scale. In the end, Moscow was never the key to victory. It was only the point where the war stopped being winnable on German terms. And that is what makes this alternate history so unsettling. The fall of Moscow would not simply have changed borders. It would have changed the shape of the war itself, and possibly made its collapse even more inevitable.